My name is Marin Calloway. I was 29 on my wedding day, and that morning I learned my father had chosen my sister again. The florist had barely cleared the suite when a thin envelope slid under the bridal room door and stopped against my shoe. Inside sat a printed event receipt under Brenna's name and one sticky note that read, "There is no advancement reception. Check the deposit time." For 1 second, I thought it was a joke, until I saw the timestamp printed in the upper corner above the ballroom hold. The room at the Langford had been booked 3 days earlier on a personal card, not through the museum or any employer account. Brenna had told my father a board member was flying in from New York, but real donor events do not appear on personal deposits. My hands went cold before my face did, and that frightened me more than tears because cold meant I understood how deliberate this was. She had not just taken my father for the evening, she had built a polished lie around his weakness, his need to feel needed. I called Rowan and heard him stop outside the door before his voice came through. Low and steady. "Tell me what you need now." I unlocked the door just enough to pass him the receipt, and when he looked up, the room changed in that quiet way. Truth changes. He did not smother me with comfort or turn my shock into noise, and that restraint held me together better than any speech could. I folded the sticky note and slid it into my clutch beside my lipstick, because if truth had reached me first, begging would feed Brenna. In less than an hour, I was still marrying Rowan, still walking toward him, still wearing the silk gown Diana had buttoned that morning. What changed was the story under the dress. Because now I knew my father had not chosen duty somewhere else. He had been steered away. I looked at the deposit line one time, pressed the paper flat against the vanity, and told my reflection, "You do not chase anyone today." Before my mother died, our house in Northbrook ran on small routines that made everything feel fixed, and my father moved through them like a man who knew where he belonged. He left for work in pressed shirts, came home with grocery flowers when my mother had late clinic hours, and still remembered which nights I wanted him in the audience. My sister Brenna and I were already different by then, but difference did not feel dangerous when my mother still stood in the middle of us. Helen Calloway worked as a pediatric occupational therapist, and she had a way of making a room settle without raising her voice or asking twice. She kept our week moving with handwritten calendars, packed lunches, and that calm line she used whenever Brenna and I started circling each other. "We are not competing here." Back then, my father still laughed at dinner, still asked to see my draft pages, and still told Brenna her sharpness would carry her farther than charm ever could. When my mother got sick, the house changed first in sound, then in timing, and finally in who was allowed nearest to my father. The dishwasher ran later. The lights stayed on longer downstairs, and Brenna began answering questions before I had opened my mouth. By the time my mother died, grief had made my father grateful for any child who looked organized, useful, and close enough to manage the parts of life he no longer wanted to touch. Brenna stepped into that opening with a steadiness that looked generous from the outside, and for a while, even I mistook it for strength. She handled pharmacy calls, reminded my father about appointments, filtered family updates, and turned herself into the person standing nearest every practical decision. I was younger, quieter, still walking around with my mother's last week sitting inside my chest, and that made me easy to describe as distant. Once Brenna became the one delivering information, she also became the one shaping it, and the damage never arrived as one dramatic lie. A missed school ceremony became "Marin thought you were busy," a canceled dinner became "she already made other plans," and disappointment kept reaching my father wearing my face. He was not cruel, and that made the whole thing harder to name, because neglect built out of convenience leaves fewer bruises and deeper doubt. By the time I met Rowan, I had already learned how quickly a family can start speaking through one person until everyone else sounds unreliable. The first thing that startled me about his family was how directly they loved each other, with no translator standing in the doorway and no one managing access. That was why I still called my father first after Rowan proposed, and when he promised he would walk me down the aisle, I let myself believe one clear sentence could outrun years of smaller betrayals. 3 months before the wedding, Brenna called while I was approving place cards. Wearing that polished warmth she saved for attacks she wanted, remembered politely. She told me she had to host a private advancement reception for the museum on June 18th, the same Saturday as my ceremony, and paused. Then she added, almost sweetly, some opportunities only come once. Marin. And I heard the trap before I heard the excuse forming. I called my father immediately and reminded him he had promised to walk me down the aisle, because plain questions leave less room for manipulation. He exhaled like a man already searching for language to disappoint me without ever saying no, then started listing traffic, timing, distance, and everybody's complicated expectations. Each practical phrase landed harder because none of them sounded like logistics. Once I understood he was slowly backing away from me. Brenna knew exactly how to package cruelty for my father, wrapping it in career language, donor schedules, and the kind of pressure respectable men fear. She texted him names he would never verify, mentioned a board member flying from New York, and made absence sound professionally embarrassing. When I called her back, she laughed softly and asked whether I was really asking Dad to miss something important for dinner. I nearly dropped the phone at dinner, because weddings only become small when the person talking has already decided your place can shrink. 2 weeks before the ceremony, my father called again, and this time there was no soft delay left in his voice anywhere. He told me he could not make both events, and that I should ask someone else to do the walk instead for me. My body registered it before thought did, and I ended up on the kitchen floor with the phone still burning in my hand. Place cards covered the table. The takeout had gone cold, and every neat wedding detail suddenly looked like proof I had miscalculated. When Rowan came home, I handed him the seating chart first, because paper felt steadier than my voice in that moment exactly. He looked at the untouched food, then at my face, and asked whether I wanted to move the date right then before anything broke further. I told him no, because postponing would hand Brenna exactly what she wanted. A wedding she could move simply by deciding I mattered less. That was the night the ceremony stopped feeling like a family celebration and started feeling like evidence of who would publicly choose me. The next morning, Diana asked me to meet her near the Harold Washington Library, and I went because staying home had started to feel like agreeing. She did not offer me hollow comfort or tell me blood always finds its way back when people calm down enough. She set a paper cup beside my hand and asked one clean question. If your father left the place empty, why would you spend your wedding begging him to fill it? That question followed me upstairs to the archive office, where Silas was waiting. Jacket folded over one arm and a latte already cooling near him. He looked at my face once, looked at the untouched latte once, and understood enough to spare me the humiliation of explaining grief like logistics. When I asked whether he would walk me down the aisle, he nodded before I finished and told me no bride should have to drag dignity into a room alone. I cried then, but only for a minute, because relief is steadier than panic when somebody means exactly what they offer. Silas did not turn the moment into a speech, and that restraint landed harder than grand promises ever could have. He reached into his satchel, slid over a small folder from Diana and Rowan, and told me to read it before deciding what today required. Inside were 3 things that shifted my breathing back into order. A screenshot Brenna had accidentally sent to the family thread, a room confirmation, and a guest count. The screenshot mentioned a lounge at the Langford. The confirmation listed a personal card hold for $5,000, and the guest count barely reached 15. I work in event copy, and fake polish leaves, fingerprints, so the missing employer billing line mattered more than any dramatic confession could. Real advancement receptions do not run on a rushed personal hold. A half-empty list, and private texts dressed up like institutional planning. Diana had circled the deposit code in pen. Rowan had highlighted the booking window, and together they gave me what Brenna never expected me to hold. Not revenge. Not yet. Just shape. Just Sequence. Just enough evidence to stop feeling crazy inside my own wedding week. That afternoon, I stopped asking whether my father might still change his mind and started saving every document that made Brenna's story look thinner. I printed the room confirmation, forwarded the screenshot to a private folder, and kept the guest count beside my vows like two versions of truth. By the time I zipped my garment bag that night, I was still heartbroken. But heartbreak had finally made room for strategy. By the time the ceremony began that day, I had stopped scanning doorways and measuring what still stood in front of me. Silas offered his arm with the same quiet certainty he had carried into the archive office, and I took it without apology. When the doors opened and I saw Rowan waiting, the absence behind me stayed real, but it no longer owned the room. Silas walked me down the aisle as if he understood that dignity sometimes arrives wearing a borrowed title and a steady hand. I felt every guest register the substitution, then accept it, because no one watching there could mistake tenderness for performance or pity. Rowan's face changed when he saw who brought me forward, and one look told me love had noticed the wound without shrinking it. The vows held, the rings fit, and the reception began with enough warmth that I almost confused survival with peace that evening. Then my father appeared near the ballroom entrance holding a wrapped box, late enough to miss the ceremony and still expect access. He kissed my cheek, looked over my shoulder, and asked who had walked me, as if the answer could possibly hurt less. I told him Silas had done it, and his expression shifted with the blunt surprise of a man seeing that vacancy filled. Before he could build a softer version of what he had done, one of Rowan's relatives crossed over carrying a phone now. A contact at the Langford confirmed the booking type for Brenna's event, and the screen showed the reservation code printed on my folder. I led my father to a table off the dance floor, set down the confirmation, guest count, and screenshot Brenna had sent by mistake. The code matched. The $5,000 hold sat under her own name, and the list barely covered 15 people despite her story about donors. I pointed to Brenna's line. If he chooses me once in public, that should settle it. And my father had nothing left. He stepped into the hall to call her, and even through the closed ballroom doors, I could hear the conversation breaking apart. First came denial, then irritation, then the turn people take when facts keep returning in the same exact order before them there. When he came back, his face looked older, not because Brenna had lied, but because he understood how often convenience replaced another question. The reception did not collapse into shouting, and that mattered more than spectacle because I had not protected this day to feed chaos. My father stood still beside the papers, the gift box unopened, while the music carried on around him there without waiting still. Across the room, Rowan watched me. Silas stayed where he was, and my family's truth existed there without begging anyone to believe it. Rowan and I left for Maine 2 mornings later, and the quiet there felt different because nobody was chasing me for forgiveness before I had even unpacked my hurt. My father filled my phone with voicemails while the tide kept rolling in, and for once I let them sit unheard until I could bear his voice. Brenna stopped calling completely, which told me more than any apology could. Because silence is what people choose when the story no longer obeys them. When we got home, I agreed to meet my father at a breakfast place in Wilmette, where nobody could mistake a private plea for reconciliation already earned. He looked at me across coffee and eggs and admitted he had let Brenna become the filter between us for years. I told him if he wanted any place in my life now, he would speak to me directly. Not through her, not around me, and never instead of me. That was the only promise I asked for, because I was not rebuilding childhood, and I was not reopening a ceremony already survived. Brenna lost the center she had fought to hold, not through one dramatic punishment, but because nobody trusted her version first anymore. Silas and Diana stayed exactly where they had stood that week, close enough to prove family can be chosen by presence, not inherited by name. I still think about that ballroom table sometimes. The reservation code, the guest list, and the unopened gift box sitting between what was promised and what was done. Those papers did not give me revenge, but they gave me sequence, and sequence gave me back my footing. Thank you for staying with this story. And if any part of it felt uncomfortably familiar, I hope it still leaves you believing peace can be rebuilt. Love can arrive cleanly, and the life waiting after heartbreak can be gentler than the one that broke it.